Stephen Pinker, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Talia. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So first, just tell the world who you are if they don't already know. You're pretty famous and prolific, and so some people may know you. You, in 2004, which is the year actually I was born, you were named one of Time's 100 most influential people in the world today, and you have written lots of books and lots of art. So just tell the world who you are and sort of how you've shaped the disciplines that you are involved in and sort of your history within academia.
Sure. I'm currently I'm a professor of psychology at Harvard University. I was trained in experimental cognitive psychology, did my thesis on visual cognition, how people visualize three-dimensional space and objects. I did research on how people recognize faces and objects, how they allocate visual attention across the visual field, how they form mental images, how they mentally rotate scenes in space. But I also did, starting from the time that I was a graduate student, here in this department at Harvard. I was a grad student at Harvard. I originally got my undergraduate degree at McGill University in Montreal, which is where I'm from. But I came to Harvard for grad school. I've spent most of my adult life in Cambridge. I spent many years as a professor at MIT in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences before moving back to Harvard. But starting from the time I was a grad student, I was also interested in language acquisition in children, starting with really a theoretical orientation of just how is language acquisition even possible? You have a child who doesn't know whether they're going to end up speaking Japanese or Yiddish or Swahili. They hear sentences in context, and 3 years later, they're talking a blue streak in their language, their understanding, their speaking. How does that work? How does it work even in theory? How could any system do that? And what is the system that we actually find in human beings? So I wrote a book called Language Learnability and Language Development, a pretty technical academic book on proposing a theory as to what's going on in the child's mind when they're figuring out how language works. And it surveyed a lot of the literature on child language development. I then became an experimentalist in child language itself, together with the experimental work I did on visual cognition. So we would bring kids in with little ducks and bunnies and have them see how they understood sentences, see what they produced. At the same time, also studying transcripts of children's speech that collected originally here at Harvard by my advisor, Roger Brown, who starting way back in the 60s, did the first project that actually documented kids' language development almost in real time. He and his students, who kind of went on to dominate the field of language development, would go into the homes of 3 kids and just let the tape recorder run for 2 hours every 2 weeks for several years, from the time that they were just producing their first 2-word combinations like play checkers, doggy run, more milk, to the time that they were speaking in sentences. And then later, much later, put those transcripts online in the child language data exchange system, together with many other data sets on children's language. So I spent a good chunk of my career doing studies of that very rich data set of just kids spontaneously speaking. And in fact, a lot of that, the work that I did in language development and adult language, was on an issue that has suddenly become popular again, which is that how does a language understanding system work? Does it depend on grammatical rules, like to form the past tense, add the suffix ed? Or is it a big neural network where you associate the sounds of words with the sounds of their past tense forms, and there's no distinct mental operation that actually adds a suffix? And the reason that that's newly relevant is we've all been surprised, blown away by the success of large language models like ChatGPT, which would seem to point to the other side of the debate that I was on, the debate in favor of associative neural networks, which don't have any explicit rules or operations or linguistic units, at least not built in, but are just, they have the living daylights trained out of them, and at the end of the day, they're pretty good at using language, even though there was no rules that were built in. Now, one can ask the question of are they at all realistic as models of what a child does? And there's a lot of reasons I think they aren't. Among them, that they would need the equivalent of 30,000 years of listening to mom and dad's speech to come up with the skills that they have. Kids do it in 3 years, so it suggests that they've got a bit of a head start. So I would argue, but that's the kind of debate that I was embroiled in the field of psycholinguistics. And indeed, one of my former grad students and collaborators, now completely famous in his own right for different reasons, is Gary Marcus, who is probably the main critic of large language models, neural network models, for some of the same reasons that he and I explored in the context of figuring out why kids make errors like sticked and teared and cummed and braked and goed, why they overgeneralize the past tense form to irregular forms. So the debates that we hashed out with our fellow psycholinguists has kind of come back in terms of does the human mind work the way ChatGPT works? Anyway, that was that. If all I ever did was studies of children's errors with the past tense, I probably wouldn't have made that Time magazine list. So I did branch out after writing a book called The Language Instinct, which tried to explain everything that people are interested in language. I would meet someone, they say, what do you do for a living? And I say, well, I'm a professor, I study language. They'd say, wow, that's really interesting. And it is really interesting. Language, everyone's interested in language. So I wrote a book on trying to answer people's natural curiosity about how language works, called The Language Instinct. The title came from a quote by Charles Darwin: "Man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, while no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write." So that gave me my title. It gave me the overarching idea that language was a human instinct, associated in a slightly different form with, of course, the most famous linguist of the living and dead, Noam Chomsky, who argued that language has an innate basis. So I tried to kind of merge those ideas. It led to the one thing leads to another. And at the end of the book, The Language Instinct, I said, well, if language is an instinct, what are the other human instincts? Do we have instincts for aesthetics, for emotions, for social interactions? And that became my next book, called How the Mind Works. That led to questions of if there is such a thing as human nature, that is, if there are ways of thinking and feeling and pursuing goals that are products of evolution, that are wired into us, what does it say about the kind of society we live in? What does it say about our morals? Does it mean that we can hope for social change, or because you can't change human nature, are we stuck with all of the crime and inequality and war and that we see around us, or is there any hope for improvement? As I said, one thing leads to another. So then I wrote a book called The Blank Slate, on the very idea of human nature, the blank slate being the denial that there's human nature. And I explored why the topic gets people so exercised. Whether what's innate, what is learned, nature and nurture is not just a scientific topic, but it ties into political controversies. It ties into controversies on child rearing, on the arts, on politics. And so that book was on all of the political and emotional baggage around the concept of human nature. And I promise I'll stop talking soon. But that in turn led to since I dealt with the question, does the existence of human nature kind of dash all hopes for progress? Because you can't change human nature, as people think. And I mentioned in the book that the answer has got to be no, because we've seen progress. Slavery was abolished, and the Soviet Union went out of existence peacefully, and we no longer disembowel people in public. So clearly there's been progress. And after I wrote the book, I started getting correspondence from people in different fields, in criminology and sociology and war and peace studies, saying, I agree with you that there's been progress, but you could have made a much stronger case. Here's a graph on number of war deaths over time, and it kind of went down. And here's a graph on sexual coercion and rape and domestic violence, and each one of those curves goes down. Here's a data on child abuse, and that went down. Here's a data on homicide. And I thought, geez, I didn't know this. This is much better news than I would have anticipated. And so I wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature on the historical decline of violence, something that people don't even know exists, and why it happened. Why were our ancestors so violent? Obviously, many of us still are violent. Violence hasn't been eliminated, but quantitatively, when you plot it, it's less than it used to be worse. And then I promise I'll stop talking soon. The follow book Enlightenment Now extended that story to show that it isn't just in violence that we've seen human progress, but we live longer, fewer women die in childbirth, fewer babies die, fewer people live in poverty. Life in general is not perfect, but it's a lot better than it used to be. And people just don't appreciate why. And I attributed that to the Enlightenment, to the idea that we can use human reason to improve human well-being. Anyway, that's my career.
Yeah, and then more recently you wrote a book on rationality as well.
Rationality, yes.
Yeah.
I was going to mention that, but I thought, oh geez, I've been jabbering away for too long. I better let Talia break in.
No. I have been thinking about your evolution a lot, and sort of how not only have you gone from linguist to someone who's looking at how the mind works to someone who's looking at violence and the decline of violence in human nature, but you also have made this shift from person in academia to real public intellectual. And that's
Yeah,
cool.
I do.
Yeah.
I got to you get to meet really interesting people and do really things that most academics don't do. I'm originally Canadian, and I got an invitation to have lunch with the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. For a Canadian boy, that was a real thrill, and it is an example of how I've been very lucky to have not just lived an academic life, which I still live. I'm here in my office. I just met with grad students, but also I've been greatly fortunate to be exposed to a wider world of ideas, politics, media, etc.
Etc. Yeah. So let's talk about what you have found to be true about language, and not just language, but linguistic universals, so all language, and how specifically language relates to cognition and human nature. I feel like there's these two kind of dissociable things that language influences, and that cognition and human nature. And so you have written so much stuff. Again, yeah, I read The Language Instinct, and you wrote this thing called The Rules of Language, which I have right next to me, and the Faculty of Language, What's Special About It, and you have all these findings. So what is going on here with language and human nature versus cognition, and sort of also, language variation being a real part of that, and how that relates to cognition and human nature? But I just want to give you the opportunity to, talk, what is language?
Yes, so I think language is the way in which we coordinate our behavior and exchange knowledge. And I think it's inherent to being human. That's why we, unlike our primate cousins, fanned out over the entire globe and transformed the entire globe. Because not just because of language. I think if you just magically were able to surgically implant language in a chimpanzee, I don't think they would be like humans, because it isn't just language. Language wouldn't be useful unless we had something to say, and unless we were on speaking terms with other people. So I think it's I've suggested that humans evolved into what a term that I got from my late friend John Tooby, the cognitive niche, a lifestyle that combines know-how, that is, developing cognitive models of the world, of how physical objects behave, how living things behave, how other people behave, kind of a mental model of the world. So that's a cognitive adaptation. A social adaptation, we're pretty unusual among animals as to how much cooperation we have, even among people who aren't related to us. We aren't just nice to our relatives, but we cooperate in groups, from couples to societies. And then language, and I think these three, each of the two makes the third more useful. That if you have knowledge of, how to make a fire, how to trap an ostrich, then you can share it with others through language. That means that you're more valuable to other people because they have things to learn from you. And because language is what language shares is not stuff, but knowledge, and knowledge can be duplicated indefinitely without loss. If I give you a banana, I don't have the banana. If I teach you how to find bananas, I don't know any less. The fact that I know it, now you know it, now we both know it. And language is really powerful at doing that, sharing information which can be duplicated without loss. And it means that what biologists tell us is that you only get societies when the organisms have something to exchange, where it benefits both of them to exchange it. Because otherwise, evolution selects for selfishness. But language is the ultimate trade good, because I can give you something at very little cost to me. As I said, if I teach you something, it's not that I no longer know it. Now we both know it. So everybody wins. And so this means that humans with language and social relations and know-how can be a very formidable species. And I think that language is not the same as thought, but it certainly makes thoughts more worth having, because it's not just you who benefits from the knowledge, but you can share it.
That's really
so I think
interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think language is not the same as thought, and so I'm definitely not a Worfian, and at least not a linguistic determinist. And there's a lot of data, a lot of evidence for that. There are people who lose language because of brain damage. They're aphasic, but they are not necessarily cognitively impaired. There are people who are linguistically fluent while they are cognitively impaired. They seem to involve different brain circuits. So I think they are. And of course, the fact that very often we're kind of at a loss for words. We know we want to say something, but it comes out wrong. We're misunderstood. We know that we're misunderstood. We struggle to put our thoughts into words when we write. Even that subjective experience reminds us that language and thought aren't the same thing. Now, I wrote another book that we didn't talk about called Stuff of Thought, Language as a Window into Human Nature, where I then asked the question, okay, language is not the same as thought, but what does it tell us about thought? Because it's got to tell us a lot. That's why we have language. I mean, not just thought, but also our social relations. So I have a chapter based on work that I've done that I haven't even had a chance to talk about, on the relationship between the meanings of words and the syntax of sentences. And I wrote a whole book on that, fairly technical book called Learnability and Cognition, and did a bunch of studies with kids on how their understanding of verb meaning plays into the actual syntax of their sentences and vice versa. That was a big chunk of my career. But in the Stuff of Thought, I tried to share that knowledge to a general audience. What do our nouns tell us about the human concept of an object and stuff, especially count versus mass nouns? What do verbs tell us about the human concept of causality and agency? What do prepositions say about our concept of space? What does tense say about our concept of time? But also, I didn't want to just stick with the nerdy stuff of the physical world, but I had a chapter on what do changing trends in baby names tell us about social contagion, social trends, social fads. So your name, Talia, when I grew up, there were no Talias. There were lots of Susans, there were Lindas, there are Barbaras, there are Deborahs, and I'm willing to bet that none of your friends are named Susan. Is that right?
That's
Maybe
right.
Suzanne. How
No.
about any Nancys?
No, but I have a friend with a mother named Susan, another friend with a mother named Nancy.
A mother.
So,
See, there you
yeah.
go. Okay, so there's a chapter on that. More so, by the way, for girls' names than boys' names. Boys' names, you probably don't know a lot of Stevens. That was huge in my
A
cohort.
few. I know a few, actually.
But you know a
Isn't that
few, yeah.
interesting?
So
Yeah.
boys' names don't churn as much as girls' names. But anyway, then I had another chapter on language and emotion, where I talked about swearing, and more generally about taboo language. Why are terms often for sex, for excretion, for race, for religion, religious concepts, for death and disease, often kind of unsayable. And then one on related to pragmatics, or that pragmatics in the linguist sense of how language is used in a conversational and social context. Why do people so often not say what they mean?
Yep.
How come they just don't blurt stuff out? But we have politeness. If you could pass the salt, that would be awesome. You want to come up for Netflix and chill.
Oh,
Nice
okay.
out there. It would be a real shame if something happened to it. People don't often take pains not to say what they mean. How come? What does that say about social interaction? And so there was a chapter on that, which I have then developed into a bunch of studies and into yet another book I'm currently writing on the phenomenon of common knowledge. That is, knowing that everyone knows something. So common knowledge is when I know something, you know it, I know that you know it, you know that I know that you know it ad infinitum. And that's another manifestation of how language is used in a social context. Language generates common knowledge. If you say something, it's kind of out there. You can't deny that the people who hear it know it, and you can't deny that they know that you know it. And what does that say about how we live our lives?
Yeah. I want to ask specifically about the pragmatic thing. Like, why is that? I have been fascinated by this, and every TED talk I've ever given about, it's not just sex, it's not just Netflix and chill. It's like a long list of things that we
No, it
cannot
is.
talk
Yes.
about. We cannot ask someone to pass the salt. We cannot ask someone to turn down the temperature. We cannot say to someone, to say that they have food on their plate. It's a really weird world we live in if you think about it semantically. So why is it that we have this problem being direct and clear, but I guess too, why is it that we use language as the crutch to kind of get over that hurdle? We could go about asking for things, or it could be that body language as the indicator. Why is it that language is what we use to fill that pragmatic gap?
Yeah. Well, so that's two questions, and both of them are excellent.
Okay.
Language, thanks to syntax, can convey relationships much better than gesture, and propositions like what is true, what is false, who did what to whom. Um, uh, you can kind of just talk about stuff, but if you want to convey precise information, propositions, truth, falsity, language is designed for that. It categorizes. Gestures are analog, but words are really digital. There's to convey temperature, you can use hot, you can use cold, but you can't just say cold, louder and louder and louder, or higher, 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 or there's no way to express analog quantities via language. So that means there's some things that language is not good for, which is why we have gesture and art and graphs and alternatives to language. But for discrete relationships of who did what to whom, what is where, what is true of what, that's kind of what language is designed for. Then why do we forego this very powerful tool and not just say what's on our minds? Why do we use euphemism and innuendo and shilly-shallying and beating around the bush and catching your drift and reading between the lines? Why don't we just come out and say it? So I think it's a profound question, and one that actually linguists, despite decades of studying implicature and conversational postulates and all the Gricean phenomena, they haven't really dealt with that fundamental question of why do we even bother? Not how it works, but why not just blurt it out? I think it's because linguists tend to be a little squeamish about all of this charged stuff like threats and sex and status and dominance. Psychologists are more comfortable with that, but linguists tend to be a little dainty when it comes to human emotion. So here's what I think is going on. Let's go. We'll keep it PG rated, and we'll talk about say passing the salt. So why don't you just say, "Give me the salt"? Well, it's kind of like if you and I are friends, or worse, if we're strangers, or we're colleagues. I don't want to treat you like like a butler, like a servant. And if I blurt out, "Give me the salt," it's kind of, there is, depending on how of course how intimate we are, but it can be seen as disrespectful. It presupposes that I can bark out a command and you're going to do what I say. Now I may not want our social relationship to be like that. I want it to be, may want it to be that we're just, you and I are peers, we're equals. And if I say, if you could pass the salt, that would be awesome. Even though that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It wouldn't be awesome, but that's the way people talk. And it's a way that the politeness reflex is a way of doing two things at once. Conveying the message, I really would like you to pass me the salt, not challenging your social relationship as peers or respectful strangers. So that's a way to split the difference. And I think that is in general true of indirect speech. So I'll give you another example. If you go to fundraising events, which unfortunately I have to go to every once in a while, Harvard trots me out when they try to get rich people to donate money. They never say, the dean, after nice dinner and everyone pretends they're great friends. He never says, okay, pull out your checks, give us money. He says, which of course is, everyone knows that's what he means, why they're there. But there's a kind of a simulation of kind of faux friendship. And so he'll say things like, we're counting on you to show leadership in our campaign for the future. And perhaps you'll be inclined to make a gift. Gift, well, I might give you a gift. Friends give each other gifts all the time. So it maintains the social relationship of friendship, of convivial social gathering, while slipping in the message, okay, now it's time to pull out your checkbook. Likewise, and in other cases where, again, there's a disconnect between the content of the message and the type of social relationship. So getting back to the Netflix and chill, if two, say, platonic friends, neither one knows that they're ready to kind of cross over to a sexual relationship, but they want to kind of assess the other one's interest. But the thing is, as soon as it's out there, your relationship can never be the same again. And it's just, it's on the other person's mind. So how do you navigate that? Our species would never have propagated itself if no one was able to make a move on anyone else. On the other hand, it can be very fraught if they're platonic friends, or even worse, of course, say in workplace situations, if it's a boss and an employee, or a professor or a student. And so people kind of slip into this mumbo jumbo, this innuendo, when they want to kind of get the information across, but without flipping their relationship from, say, platonic to sexual, which emotionally and psychologically is a big deal. And so if the other person says, no, I've seen that movie, or no, I got to get home to study, then they can each come away feeling, oh, well, we're still friends. Oh yeah, well, she wasn't in the mood to watch a movie, and go back to, pretending it never happened. Whereas if someone just blurted it out, hey, do you want to have sex? They can never go back to just being platonic friends. And so on with threats, so on with bribes. Tendering a bribe, that kind of changes the nature of your relationship forever. If you think the person might accept the bribe, you want to find out if they can accept the bribe. You don't want it to be, well, from now on, I'm bribing you and we're doing a business transaction. You're selling your perks for cash. That's a big deal. And so you don't want to change the relationship to that kind of transactional relationship. If it's, say, a cop and a driver, if it's a maitre d' and someone in a restaurant, people are just always mindful of their social relationships, at the same time as sometimes they got to exchange information that may clash with their social relationship. Anyway, that's a theory.
That's a theory. That's a great theory. Leading off of that probably leads me to believe that you think that language is an evolutionary adaptation. And you have said in the past that Chomsky is, quote, actively hostile to this idea, that language is this evolutionary adaptation. Why do you think you are correct? Why is language an evolutionary adaptation? And what do we, I guess, stand to gain from that, of seeing language as something subject to Darwin's principles?
Well, number of things. If it's what is the alternative? And Chomsky, to some people's surprise, has long argued that language is an inborn, biologically wired-in capability, but that it didn't get there via natural selection. And a lot of people are puzzled. Some people call him a creationist. That's not that is not true. But how did it get there? If it wasn't, that's where complex things come from. We have eyes because our ancestors, beginning with light-sensitive pigment spots, out-reproduced the ones that didn't have them, and so on and so on for other parts of the eyeball, culminating in the eyes that we have now. We have eyes because they helped our ancestors reproduce. Now, the alternatives, one is that Chomsky's kind of floated over the years is, well, maybe it's just a law of physics that when you get a brain that is so big, language just emerges. Now, that strikes me as just kind of hoping for a miracle. Why would something as useful as language just emerge when you pack in a lot of neurons? Or more recently said there was a single lucky mutation that just popped up, and ever since we've kept it. But we just know language, in fact, no cognitive or personality trait is controlled by one gene, sometimes called the fourth law of behavioral genetics. And you never see a mute who is just mute because they don't have the magical gene. So the idea that language was the product of one macro mutation, I think is false, just based on what we know from language disorders, that it's they're heritable, but like most heritable traits, highly polygenic, many genes, each with a partial contribution. And also, there's just no, unlike some things where I think you can legitimately ask why, what does it do for us? I think it's not clear that music is an adaptation, but language, there's really no mystery. Social life would be impossible without language. It's how we coordinate our behavior, how we meet at the same time, at the same place, cooperate on things, how we share knowledge, how we share information. It would be a miracle if something that useful did not actually emerge in our ancestors thanks to the gifts that it bestowed.
I think the analogy you gave once was that we think of music as an evolutionary adaptation, but really I think it's like cheesecake. That music and cheesecake, right?
That's an analogy. It may not have been it's an analogy that I came up with that may not have been the best one, because people get distracted. Like, oh, you're saying it's like empty calories and it's not healthy. That isn't the point. The point is, and you brought that up. That was in the last chapter of How the Mind Works. Mm-hmm. Is that it's not obvious how music helped our ancestors have more babies. What people often say is, oh yeah, well, all the women want to sleep with Mick Jagger. And I said, well, I think it's a really crummy explanation, because most people who play and enjoy music are not Mick Jagger. You have to have another example. Mick Jagger is now 80, although he's, looks pretty good for someone in his 80s. And who knows, maybe he still attracts groupies for all I know. But the thing is, most people who listen to music are not Mick Jagger. It's just not a good theory.
Yeah.
And also, I was a participant in one of the co-authors in a big study on the cross-cultural universality of music. Samuel Mayer, M-E-H-R, was the main mover behind that, the natural history of song. And we did find that music is universal across, including small-scale hunter-gatherer and forager and peasant societies. But there isn't one thing that people use music for. It's not that music evolved for, getting the troops together in preparation for fighting. It's not that it's only used for courtship. It's not that it's only used for lullabies. And in fact, every society uses music for multiple things. So we found no evidence that one particular function of music is the central function. And so the cheesecake analogy is that we're smart. Some things give us pleasure. One of the things you can do with your intelligence is invent things that give you pleasure. There's nothing in evolution that can rule that out. And so we do all kinds of things that don't increase our number of babies. Thank goodness. That would be a pretty dull and grim existence if we just constantly did everything that we could to pump out babies. We read, we make movies, we play games, and that's just because we're smart enough to do that, to press our own pleasure buttons. Cheesecake being an example in the realm of food, it's not that we evolved with a desire for cheesecake. We couldn't. There was no cheesecake when we evolved, but we could have, once we evolved with, say, a taste for fats, a taste for sugar, a taste for creamy textures, and you had enough ingenious cooks, they came up with this thing called cheesecake and many other delicious foods that were way beyond anything that our ancestors could have had in when we evolved. But they give us probably more pleasure than slightly riper fruit or a little bit of fatty meat. They kind of pack together a concentrated dose of stuff that gives us pleasure. And once you have a smart species, there's nothing to prevent us from doing it. And we do all kinds of things just because we're smart enough to give ourselves pleasure. That's the theory.
Right. But you're saying that language is this constant thing that is innate, that is needed for more than pleasure, for more than curiosity. It is how it's everything. Yeah.
Language you don't have. Yes. So for one thing, language, unlike cheesecake, wasn't just invented by one culture.
Sure.
For another, language, there's no mystery or no question as there is for music as to what's in it for us. What good does it do? You just can't live a human life without language, and certainly no society could have achieved what it has achieved without language. That's the story of the Tower of Babel.
Yeah. So I guess along with that, I kind of want to pack in two things because I know we have to wrap up, but first off, why language? Why should we study this amazing, wonderful thing? Why do you study it? Why should anyone study it? But I guess if you'd be willing to divulge, what is next for you, given that you have written so many books and done so much research? Yesterday, I went to see Emily Oster, who's here at Brown, and I know her through a friend. Right. Yeah. And I know that you wrote.
I'm a huge fan. I wrote her. She was that you mentioned most the most significant people in the world today.
Yes.
So she got that designation the year before last, and I wrote the piece in Time magazine on why she deserved it.
And it was beautifully written. I mean, we haven't even talked about that, but you also wrote a book about style and how to write well in the world. And that has influenced my writing greatly, and I'm sure many other people's writings. And you're a brilliant writer. I particularly liked how in the blank slate you put a lot of literary references. So that was fun. You were quoting Austen, you were quoting Updike, and isn't that fun? But yeah, why language? What's next for you? What's going on? Yeah.
Well, so the first question, language it's an amazing ability in and of itself. Just the fact that you and I were going blah, 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 and interesting stuff has come out. We're thinking thoughts about human social relationships and war and peace and anything. Language is this open-ended system for conveying not just topics, it's not just like we're saying war, isn't that interesting? Yeah, it's really interesting. We're actually saying stuff about it, like rate of battle deaths have come down over time.
Right.
That's amazing that we as a species have this ability. How does it work? What's the if you try to reverse engineer it, what is it about syntax that allows us to convey complex ideas and phonology and morphology and all the rest? But then the second reason is it also is, as I said, a window into human nature. It tells us about our relationships of power. It tells us about our conception of space and time and causality and objects, about our trends and fads, as in the case of naming babies. It just shows it's not the same as human nature, but it just reveals so much about human nature. So back to your second question, what next? Well, a lot of my life, especially in the last few months, weeks, days, and hours, has been devoted to the question of academic freedom.
Okay.
And why, of all places, universities should be telling people you can't say that, given that you think that academia is the place where you hash out ideas. And if you're prevented from voicing ideas, you'll never know whether they're right or wrong. But as we all know, academia has been infected with a kind of censorship and cancel culture. So that's part of my activities. But my once that dies down and I can actually get back to something closer to researching cognitive science, my main thing. I'm working on a book called Don't Go There, Common Knowledge and the Science of Harmony, Hypocrisy, and Outrage. And this is a book about common knowledge in the technical sense, in linguistics, in philosophy, in economics, of everyone knowing that everyone knows something. And that has come up for a conversation. It's part of the answer to the question of why in language people don't blurt out what they mean, but kind of beat around the bush and use implication and all this innuendo. Language generates common knowledge. Sometimes we don't want to generate common knowledge. That's when we use euphemism. But more generally, we're very sensitive, we meaning human beings, are very sensitive to the distinction between something that is out there, that everyone knows that everyone knows it, versus things that we know where we don't know that other people know it. And I think that drives a lot of phenomena. In economics, it drives phenomena like hoarding toilet paper, not because you think there's a shortage of toilet paper, but because you think other people might think that other people might think that other people are hoarding it. Or you invest in crypto, not because you think there's anything so great about crypto, but you think that other people think there's something great about it. And if they're going to buy it, then the price is going to go up. It's involved in politics. You don't just vote for the best person for president, but you vote for the person that you think a lot of other people might vote for, because you don't want to throw your vote away. And everyday social phenomena, you pitch in to something that's good for the entire group if you think you're the only one who knows that it's needed, whereas if you think other people will also know about the need, you hope that maybe they'll do it first and you'll be off the hook. There's a lot of phenomena that I think hinge on the difference between something, everyone knowing that everyone knows something, versus everyone just knowing it. And I'll just throw out one more, and that is, what's the deal behind social media shaming mobs? Why does, if someone has a joke that you can kind of interpret, maybe it's a little bit racist, even whether or not the person meant it to be, but if you could give it that spin, why then does everyone kind of pile on and ruin the life of the person who made the joke? And I think that involves norms that are common knowledge, that are threatened if the norm is breached publicly, and that people feel the urge to punish publicly, i.e., the punishment has to be common knowledge, based on historical precedents. Like, there used to be that criminal punishments were public hangings, public crucifixions, public disembowelings and burning at the stake, where you'd kind of bring out the kids for an afternoon of family fun to watch a guy get hanged. It's kind of gruesome and horrific, but every society did it, and it's common knowledge. It's a way of reinforcing the norm. See, if you break this law, you get punished, and everyone knows it, and everyone is more likely to obey the norm going forward. And I think similar dynamic happens in social media shaming.
Yeah, and there's actually really interesting questions now, though, of whether that form of punishment is the most effective at mitigating future breaches of the same sort of rule or law. A lot from philosophy, from cognitive science as well. In my high school, they had a practice of, if you broke a rule, they would read out a statement of what you did and what your punishment would be to the entire school. Yes, this really happened.
Jeez. Oh
I
my
know,
God,
and I'm 19, so this was a few years ago.
That's amazing. Well, that's
yeah.
a great example. It's kind of like it's milder, but it's the whole logic of a public hanging.
Yeah, and they stopped doing that, I think, like my senior or junior year, because people were like, "What's going on? What century are we in?" But that was
Yes, right.
that was a
Yeah.
practice, and it certainly made
Oh,
people's
interesting.
lives complicated from then on to walk around school, and everyone, no matter if you knew who they were previously, knew exactly at what time you smoked weed, where, all these, all the
Actually,
details.
if you could send me that practice in an email. I
Oh,
might use it in the book. I might use it in the book. So please send it
sure.
along.
I
You
can
know,
send you, I can connect you with a school administrator. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it was an interesting, an interesting phenomenon. But yeah, that's a really interesting book title. When is that coming out?
So I've written about a third of it. So it'll probably come out a year from September 2025.
Wow, that's so exciting. And this is, what number book is this for you?
I think it's going to be 11, maybe 12.
Okay, that's so
Depends
sure.
on how you count, like edited volumes, and but yeah,
Right.
volumes, collected volume of essays and stuff like that. But
Thank you so much for being here. You are brilliant. You are changing the world. You have changed the world. You will continue to do so. And you've certainly shaped the minds of people like myself. So
very kind of
thank
you,
you.
Talia. Thank you. Good luck with this podcast, and thanks so much for having me on.